All right, BUL3130 students, welcome to this week's lecture. As you know, this module we're covering 4 chapters and we're condensing them down into a small amount of time. These are smaller chapters, so not a tremendous amount of information being thrown at you. I am splitting this up into 2 lectures. The first one will be 9, 10, and 12. The last one will be chapter 15 because it deals with the UCC and the statute of frauds, which takes a little bit more explanation than simply talking about the offer and the acceptance and consideration. All right, so we're going to get into this, and it's not a massive amount of information. It does take a few slides to make sure that we're covering everything, but it's still not a massive amount of information. So just take your notes, and you'll be okay with uh, the quizzes and the exam when it comes time for that. Now, real quick before I get started, I am working on grading midterms today and tomorrow. So those and the grades for case study 3 will be out. I am going to move the date for case study 4 a little bit, so you have time to look at the feedback for the last 2 case studies and make sure you're making those adjustments because there's still points being lost by not paying attention to uh, your your citations, where your citations go, the proper format for those citations, those type of things. I'm going to relink the video for the APA discussion, just so you can review it. I want to make sure that you're not losing a lot of points because remember those point values are going up for the deductions as far as anything that's wrong. You should have noticed it now further into these when case study 3 gets uh, fully graded and you see it, you'll notice that you're now losing 3 points for each one of those uh, mistakes, and that can add up very quick when it's only a few points in the total assignment. All right, so let's get into this week's material. So we are discussing contracts. We'll talk about how contract law was developed, where it came from. We'll look at pieces of contracts like promissory estoppel. We'll go over that a couple of times, and we'll look into that. That's just chapter 9. So contracts are so important to our uh, business world and how we maintain our businesses and the free flow of commerce and everything that we do as far as purchases we make to the corporations we buy from and how they supply those items. Uh, Really and truly, no matter what industry you're in, you're going to run into contracts and contract negotiation. You're going to just have those type of things uh, just kind of just be there. There's not going to be you know, not many times once you're working in the business world or running a business that you do not run into some contract, some form of a contract in some way that you're involved in, whether it's your employment contract or contracts for goods, which we concentrate more on with this class and with the section that we look at, the contracts for goods and the sale of goods. But business can almost not function without a good contract law and a good understanding of contracts. When I was managing in grocery stores, we were constantly having to buy from suppliers, and those were under contract. We were contracted to buy from them. A couple of those were exclusive contracts, which you can enter into. Some of those were just contracts for those certain goods. Maybe they were the only supplier we could get the goods from, those type of things. All those little pieces go into contracts and how the contracts are negotiated. And so we'll talk about that over the course of these 3 chapters we're covering today. And then hopefully you'll have a better understanding of just the beginning phase of contracts. And then when we go over chapter 15 and tie it into specifically that sale of goods and the statute of frauds, you'll be able to tie in more the understanding you get from these first three chapters we cover into that, and it'll make more sense. If you were just to study the statute of frauds on its own, it could be a bit confusing. Just to study it by itself as a standalone item. So laying a foundation for contracts before we get into that is kind of the reason for covering 9, 10, and 12 together. Contracts evolved from common law, the older common law that was used throughout England and areas that England kind of had control over. That common law was meant to make sure that property ownership was fully understood. There were ways to ensure that there was dealing that was fair among parties. It is one of those things that just needed to be put in place. So it became part of the law, the common law, and it was common for all, was the design of it. And then when we began to develop our laws here in the United States, and we started looking at contracts and how that was going to be used, and then the UCC was developed, which we'll talk about. That is where we develop our modern contract law. So the UCC, or the Uniform Commercial Code, specifically Article 2, is the one we're going to deal with and talk about, and the one that you'll be tested on is about the sale of goods. Simply and only about the sale of goods. It doesn't cover contracts for property or any type of real property like that. It doesn't cover a lot of those things. It's about personal property that you would own, as far as like a computer or a phone or your um, a notebook, whatever it may be, those things. And when you go to purchase those, the goods you have on your shelf in your pantry, the goods that you have that you use to clean your house, those are items covered under UCC. And Article 2, specifically the UCC for the sale of goods. A sale, according to the code, is just a transfer of title from seller to buyer. Real simple. Goods or anything that's tangible, personal property. Tangible meaning you can touch it, you can hold it. I can hold this mug. Nice Valentine's present for my wife, keeps my coffee hot. I can hold that mug, and it's a tangible item that I have in my hands. If I pick up a stapler, once again, it's a tangible item. Now, I own stuff that I can't put my hands on, and those things are not tangible, so they're not covered under the sale of goods in Article 2. So it has to be something you can put your hands on. It's a tangible item, and it's not something that's an interest in land or property to that extent. Any contracts that are outside the code, general contract law governs those contracts. That's employment contracts, service contracts, insurance, real property or sale of intangibles, those type of things. You cover quite a swath of contracts there that's not covered by that article of the code. And then international contracts are covered under a different code than what are sale of goods for this. For a contract to come into being, we have to have what's called mutual assent. So this is the meeting of the minds of the parties. All right, the parties have come together and they've negotiated, and they have what is called mutual assent. They have now got to the point where they've agreed on the parts of the contract, what the offer, an offer was made. There was a acceptance, and then they've agreed on what the consideration is. Now, we'll talk about these pieces a little bit more detail as we move through the slides. But the consideration is the parties are exchanging something of benefit to them, a legal benefit or a legal detriment of some sort that they gain or give up to exchange for something else. That's as simple as you paying $2 for a candy bar, and you're receiving the candy bar. The uh, establishment is receiving the $2. That's an exchange. That's the consideration. That $2 in the candy bar are the consideration. and that is that how that exchange is made. And that is something that's covered under the UCC. That's a very simple form of a contract, which we'll discuss. The purpose of a contract must not be criminal. Anything that could be considered a tort or anything that goes against public policy. All right, so nothing that can be brought up in court saying, well, this is not legal or something you could be charged for, or that just goes against a normal public policy. Capacity, which covers a broad area, also comes into play. Capacity can be infancy, someone who is not of the age of majority. Their contracts can be voidable. Not necessarily is it impossible for someone under 18, which in the state of Florida is still considered the age of majority. It just means that your contract may not be fully enforceable if you do not maintain that contract after you reach the age of majority. Contracts can be express or implied. An express contract is where we know all the terms. We have worked those terms out. We've had negotiation, stated in words, or can be, and that can be oral or in writing. But we've decided between the parties, we decided on what's going to go in this contract, and that is what we're doing. That's what we signed off on. That's what we've agreed to. An implied and fact contract is where the agreement of the parties is inferred by their conduct. Step back to buying that candy bar. You know the candy bar's there. You know that store is offering it for sale. You're willing to buy it. You take it up to the counter or wherever it may be, to the register, and you place it on the counter. They scan it. They tell you the price. You pay that price. They give it to you. You walk out. Nowhere in that was there a negotiation involved. Nowhere in that was there an express intent of the parties, but there is an implied intent there because you have agreed to enter into that contract with them of here's money for what I want. And we both are happy because now I get, to eat the candy bar and you get money, which makes most people happy. So there's the implied part of the contract there. There was an offer, there was acceptance, and there was consideration. The offer being the candy bar on the shelf. The acceptance was you grabbing the candy bar, walking up to the counter. And then that consideration was the exchange of, remember, the exchange of a legal uh, amount, a legal item that the parties want. You're giving up you're suffering a legal detriment by you're giving away money, but you're also getting a legal benefit by receiving the candy bar. The same goes for the other party. Something they legally own, they're giving away for something you legally own. So that's the legal benefit and the legal detriment and how they work out. Contracts can be bilateral and unilateral. Bilateral is where you have both parties that exchange promises. In a unilateral contract, you'd have one party would make a promise. We'll discuss that a little bit further here in a later slide. Valid, void, voidable, and enforceable contract and unenforceable contracts. These can be very confusing. You will see these on your quiz, and almost certainly you'll see them on the final exam. So right now you need to kind of concentrate on these, get these in mind. A valid contract is one that means everything is done how it should be. That contract is binding upon all the parties involved in it, and it means that it's met all the requirements. The offer was there. It was a legal offer. The consideration or the acceptance was done. It was a legal acceptance. That consideration was legal between the two parties. There's nothing of illegal means involved. There's nothing that could be go against any type of public policy. There's not any overbearing items in that contract that would cause one person to be of more detriment than the other person that would extend beyond what is acceptable. It's a valid contract. A void contract is one where there's not a contract. There was something that happened within the contract or with how it was written or what went on. Maybe there was not an acceptance there, whatever it may be. It doesn't have any legal effect. It's not binding on the parties. And then you have what's called a voidable contract. This is a contract that, because of something that's happened within the contract, the parties may have, had an offer, did the acceptance, and were ready for the consideration, but because of something that's going on, maybe wording or maybe things like capacity or those type of items have caused this contract to be able to be voided, and so it's a voidable contract. And then contracts that are unenforceable are contracts that could be for an illegal means. You cannot force someone in court to uh, carry out a contract that was entered into for an illegal process or for an illegal act. I executed an executory. All right, so that's two phases that a contract can be in. A contract can be executory, which means that it's not yet fully performed. In other words, it's in the middle of being performed, right? So we've had the parts together, but we haven't completed that contract. An executed contract is one that we've done everything we need to do. So an executed contract is where we have the offer, we have the acceptance, the consideration was exchanged, everyone has what they were wanting out of it, and we're done. That is executed, that contract is over. Executory could be one where you're giving items into the contract over a period of time. So that could be one where it's like, okay, this week you get 5 items, next week you get 5 items, and third week you get 5 items until 15 items are satisfied, and then the contract is done. So if you're on week 2, you've given 10 items with 5 left, that's still a contract in process. So that is a contract not yet fully performed and is considered executory. Contracts can be formal or informal. Formal contracts are an agreement that's legally binding because of a particular form or mode of expression. An informal contract is any contract that's not a formal contract. Makes sense, right? Promissory estoppel. We'll talk about this more than once, but promissory estoppel is a doctrine that enforces some non-contractual promises on parties. The requirements is the promises made under circumstances that would lead the promisor to reasonably expect that the promisee or that the promise would induce the promisee to take definite or substantial action, and the promisee does not take that action. If someone has previous dealings, and I'll discuss this when we get to the slide about it in 2 chapters from now on this discussion, but really and truly it boils down to the belief of the promisor, uh, the belief that that person who has received the promise and the faith they put into the person making the promise is pretty much what it boils down to. So it's not so much the items that are in it and the way it's worded or anything like that. It's based upon how one party believes the other will fulfill the promise they've made. And of course, the courts will look at it and they will, at times, enforce those contracts to avoid someone being uh, completely just suffering an injustice. Quasi contracts are contracts that are not based on a contract as opposed to avoid any type of injustice. A quasi contract is one the courts have looked at the actions of the parties and said, by your actions, you have a contract here. So, by what you have done, by the sheer action of the parties, we see the courts would view this as a legally binding contract and they would enter them into a quasi contract. Restitution is an obligation imposed by law to avoid justice or an injustice, and then rule is a person unjustly enriched at the expense of another is subject to liability and restitution and may be required to restore the reasonable value of the benefit received. Now, what I want you to pay attention to here is we have the quasi contracts or restitution. We're forcing the parties to complete a contract that they may not have even considered to be a contract they did not fulfill their promise. We look back at promissory estoppel where the court would say, okay, this looks like it was a promise. This person believed it was a promise, and we're going to tell you to do that. Similar things happen with quasi contracts. Normally, when the courts enforce it and consider it a quasi contract, the party has begun to perform what they believe was the performance in the contract. They have believed that that consideration is there, so they're performing the consideration, or what is called performance. When the courts look at it and say, okay, well, they're acting just like this is a contract, so you're going to act like this is a contract because we're going to tell you to act like this is a contract, and they're going to impose that contract. They could also impose restitution, which would mean the party who is not acting in good faith would have to repay the amount equal to the performance by the other party. And how they do that is say, okay, well, they've done this. This is what the contract was for. They do some math or whatever it may be. And they say, okay, this is what you owe to them, or, what items you owe, or however it may be. And they enforce that. They're enforcing it. With contracts, we just left tort law before the midterm. And with tort law, it's all about compensation and damages and punitive damages and what the people were asking for. Contracts, in contrast, is completely different because we're not looking to do that. We're looking to make the parties whole. So in contracts, two parties enter into a contract. Remember the offer, the acceptance, and I say these over and over so you understand them. The offer for an item, then the acceptance of that offer, then the consideration. The consideration, that exchange of legally owned, a legal benefit that you have, something you legally have possession of that you're going to give to someone else. If you give that over and they haven't given their part, then the courts step in and say, we want to make this party whole. You're either going to give them their money back or you're going to perform what was stated that you have to do. So when they're doing that, and if they're not following through, that's when the courts will step in to enforce it as a quasi contract. That was chapter 9. Chapter 10, mutual assent. Once again, that meeting of the minds. All right. So now we're going to talk about the specific pieces here. We're going to go further into what an offer is. An offer is an indication of a willingness to enter into a legally binding contract. When you make an offer, you're saying to whoever you're making the offer to, whether it's in general, like you own a store, you have items on a shelf that in general, every person that comes in, that offer is made to, or if you specifically make the offer to a certain party, you're indicating to them that you're willing to enter into a contract with them for items or for the sale of goods. We'll keep it tied to UCC Article 2, the sale of goods. So we're saying we're willing to enter into that with you. That is an offer. The manner for which parties can show their mutual assent is by an offer and acceptance. One party makes that offer, the other party will accept it, and how that party will know that an offer is made. It's communicated in some way. They will give the offer out, whether it's sent out in an email, uh, told in person, or because there's a price tag on a shelf that shows what the item is being asked for, then that is the communication of it. Intent seems to just follow this, right? So intent in this is determined by the objective standard of what a reasonable offeree would have believed. All right. So what was the intent there? What were they, what do we think they're offering to us? And definiteness is the offer's terms must be clear enough to provide the court with a basis for giving an appropriate remedy. When a contract is designed, now, if you've ever signed on a contract for the purchase of a major good or a major item, you know that they can be confusing in how they're worded. In general, the courts want contracts to be as plain as possible so that all parties understand. And when they begin to make parties whole in contract disputes, it's real easy for them to do that. The duration of an offer can be set by the person making the offer or the party making the offer. They can say that this is an offer valid for 5 days, 30 days, whatever it may be. Radio commercials and TV commercials will always say, limited time offer, that real fast voice at the end, which is the equivalent to fine print in a print ad, says, for a limited time, act now or whatever. That is what the lapse of time in it is. Revocation is when the offer has been terminated by the one making the offer, saying that, okay, there's not going to be an offer anymore. An exception to that is an options contract, which gives the option to the person receiving the offer to at some point accept that offer, to take on that offer and give their acceptance. A firm offer, which is a merchant's irrevocable offer to buy or sell a good signed in writing. When a merchant gives you a written estimate, that is a firm offer. You get that. Or if they say, this is what I'm going to sell it for, they give it to you in writing. That is a firm offer. A firm offer in a store is that price tag. They have to sell it to you for that price tag. That's a firm offer. Statutory irrevo- irrevo- when the statute says you can't revoke it, the offer is made irrevocable by statute in that instance. The statute may say that certain contracts cannot be revoked, and that means that it's statutory irrevocability. In a unilateral contract, the offer may not be revoked for a reasonable time after performance has begun. So once the party who is doing performance in the unilateral contract, which is only one party, once they have begun to perform, then you cannot take that offer back. Of course, promissory estoppel is another way that we look at that. This will pop up throughout these slides. Rejection ends an offer too. When the party who the offer is made to rejects that offer, that terminates the offer because we're not moving forward with it. If they make a counter offer, then that also terminates the original offer. So that's how they would go away. Uh, Death or incompetency of either the offerer or offeree will terminate the offer. Destruction of the subject matter is also a termination of the offer. And if it's illegal, the offer is not valid either. Acceptance is when we've had the offer and this is what we're going to do with it. We're saying, okay, we'll take it. In a bilateral contract, it's an overt action. In a unilateral, the offeree may refrain from acting or act as requested. All right, so they just perform whatever is being asked of them in the unilateral contract. It could be, I'll give you $500 if you'll quit smoking. The person quits smoking, they will receive the $500 they began to, perform that unilateral. The offeree must communicate acceptance in a bilateral contract, but in that unilateral, they just began to perform, and that is normally enough for the courts. Of no reasonable means to learn of the offeree's acceptance through performance. They must communicate it if there's not a way for them to see it. Like, hey, I've quit. Where's my $500? Silence as acceptance. A silence or inaction does not indicate acceptance and offer unless by custom, usage, or course of dealing, such silence does offer as acceptance. All right. That custom, usage, or course of dealing. This goes back to what has been done over time. What is the normal way these things are handled? That's when that comes into play. All right. That custom, usage, and course of dealing. Provisions that can be added into it. Communication of acceptance must conform to any specification in the offer. The offer could say that you can only respond by phone, by email, or those type of terms. You can only respond in person. So that would be where there's a stipulation saying how the acceptance can happen. An authorized means, the restatement and the code provide that unless the offer provides otherwise, acceptance is authorized by any reasonable manner. All right. So if you're the one that's writing the contract up and you're making the offer and you want them to respond in a certain way to keep it all together in uniform, then you have to specify that, because if you do not, then they can give you a phone call, they can send you an email, they can send you a text, they can mail their response to you. And any of those would be acceptable because you do not specify it. Acceptance following a prior rejection, the first communication received by the offerer is effective. All right. So if you rejected it, you can't go back and, then say, yeah, I changed my mind. That offer is no longer in existence. It's up to the one making the offer to reissue the offer if you want to accept it then. All right. Check on the chart. Make sure you understand it. It just kind of lines things out a little bit more for you. And now we're going to go into chapter 12. This was fairly quick here, chapter 12. This one is consideration, all about consideration. So the last one's about offer and acceptance. This is consideration, that legal benefit or detriment that will affect the two parties. The legal detriment or the legal benefit is the big point, especially in the sale of contract. So in UCC Article 2, that major point there is the legal detriment or legal benefit. So legal detriment is doing an act one is not legally obligated to do, or not doing that act that you have a legal right to do. All right. Then a legal benefit is obtaining something to which you had no prior legal right. So you're getting something that was not yours prior to this contract, prior to this, whatever the parties are doing to do this exchange. There has to be legal sufficiency and a bargain for exchange. A bargain for exchange is real simple. This is what the offer is. This is the acceptance, and this is what we're going for here. It bargain for doesn't necessarily mean that we have to go back and forth on it. It's just this is what we're going to do. Legal sufficiency is going to be, it has to be that legal detriment or legal benefit. Adequacy is not necessarily required if the parties have freely agreed to the exchange. In other words, adequacy, it doesn't have to be even between the parties. In a unilateral contract, falling back to these, one party makes a promise, but to make the promise binding, it must be supported by consideration, some type of legal detriment or to the promisee or legal benefit to the promisor. Bilateral contracts, both parties make the promise. All right. Nothing changes as far as what's exchanged there, but both parties make a promise. In bilateral, one party makes a promise. In unilateral, if you remember just the uni and the bi part of that, then you'll be able to understand those two. An illusory promise is a promise that imposes no obligation on the promiser. And the following but these types are not illusory. An output contract, an agreement to sell all of one's product to a single buyer. That can be a binding contract. Requirements contract, an agreement to buy all of one's needs from a single producer. That could be an exclusive contract also, as far as that goes. But on down, the exclusive dealing contract is the grant to a franchisee or licensee by manufacturer of the sole right to sell goods in a defined market. Someone owning a McDonald's franchise has an exclusive dealing contract with McDonald's, corporation, their parent corporation, to sell their products, to be able to put out cups and bags and Big Macs and whatever has the name of McDonald's and carries their trademarks. Conditional promise, as far as adequacy goes, is a contract in which the obligations are contingent upon the occurrence of a stated event. All right, that's a conditional promise. Pre-existing public obligations are public duties such as those imposed by tort or by criminal law are neither a legal detriment nor a legal benefit. Pre-existing contractual obligation. I'm under contract with Santa Fe to teach you about business law. I cannot then enter into a contract with you personally to do this and you pay me extra for it because I'm already under contract to do it. I have a pre-existing obligation, pre-existing contractual obligation to teach you business law. So that is where I cannot enter into a separate contract with you for the exact same thing I'm already doing that you've already paid for. You're under contract with Santa Fe to receive this. You have a contract with Santa Fe to receive a education. Part of that education is a business law class, which I'm under contract with Santa Fe to teach. And so we have two contracts already existing there could not be a contract between us for the exact same thing because it's already been taken care of under contract. Promises that are made enforceable by contract. Some gratuitous promises have been enforceable by statute, and the code makes them enforceable. UCC makes them enforceable as contract modifications, renunciations, and firm offers. A promise to pay debt barred by statute of limitations. A new promise by a debtor to pay a debt renews the running of the statute for a second statutory period. There is a limit upon debt, and if you, by statute, certain debts have a limit on how long they're good for. If someone hasn't paid, they normally will disappear off of credit reports, and there will not be a, how companies get around this, they just sell that debt. When you enter into a new agreement with them, you start over that period for your payment in that statutory period. A promise to pay a debt discharged in bankruptcy can be enforceable without any type of consideration. You're just paying that debt because it is something that is owed. And then the moral obligation is a promise made to satisfy a pre-existing moral obligation is unenforceable for lack of consideration. It's already an obligation there. Entering into a contract with your child to provide shelter, food, and clothing, and it's already something that's a moral obligation as a parent. Promissory estoppel in a little bit more detail. It prohibits a party from denying their promise when the promisee takes action or forbearance to their detriment, reasonably based upon the promise. In other words, that promise is there. The big part of this is that when one party has a substantial amount of influence over another party, they may, because of that influence, believe what the party is saying and then begin to perform what they believe is a contract because of a promise that was made. This could also be if there's a prior history of good faith dealing between the parties. You've never had a problem with that person not fulfilling their promise, and so you automatically assume, well, this is going to be a contract, a valid contract that we're in, and we're going to do what we should do between us, and they're going to do what they need to do. I'm going to do what I need to do. It's going to be the same way it's always been. Well, in instances where that doesn't happen, you may have to show to the court that there is a history of good faith dealing, or show there was substantial influence which made the offeree just be completely in belief that a contract will be performed for a promissory estoppel to kick in. All right, so that brings us to the end of chapters 9, 10, and 12. So review this, take your notes, and the next video that I'll post will be for chapter 15 by itself, and that will be completely about the statute of frauds and what goes into that. All right, so until that video, stay safe and study hard.